Of you here tonight. I'm Ellen Hume, a former woman in the media, still a media analyst, working with Marvin Kalb at the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center, where we study things like what's happening to women in the media. And I just wanted to share an anecdote with you, just to refresh your memories, those of you who are young and used to a little bit more opportunity and equality than those of us who are old started out with anyway. When I was an enterprising reporter for the Detroit Free Press, they sent me out to cover an annual meeting. I was a business reporter, and they wanted me to cover the stockholders meeting, and it was a very small company. They made aluminum windows or window frames or something like that. And so I went into a hotel room that they had rented for this annual meeting, and it was one table filled with the men who owned and ran the company. And I came in and smiled a broad smile and introduced myself and said I was there to cover their meeting for the Detroit Free Press. And the chairman of the board was absolutely amazed and appalled. He sort of took a deep breath, and he was a very large man. And I remember he flashed a sort of diamond pinky ring at me, and he said, "Why, honey," he said, "you're here to cover this?" He said, "Wouldn't you rather be covering fashion?" And I looked him in the eye and I didn't smile, and I said, "Do you also ask blacks if they'd rather be shining shoes?" There it is. And the rest is history, which I won't bore you with. But I have tonight for you, thanks to the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center and everyone here on the panel, I hope a wonderful evening, not just of anger, and I must say there are a lot of women who are angry, but also I think of history. It's important for us to understand the history, to understand the role models, to understand the dynamic, and maybe to find new directions and new understandings together, men and women together, as we try to live in this brave new world that seems to change every day. The panelists I have for you tonight are in some ways the best in the business. I had a lot of choices for a lot of people up here tonight. Some of you are in the audience, and I hope that your questions and comments will come because some of you should be up here with us. I want to start, first of all, I'll just introduce everyone and then we'll go to comments. But Nan Robertson on the very end is really the inspiration for our program tonight. She was a reporter and feature writer for the New York Times for more than 3 decades in New York, Washington, and Paris. You may remember that she did a book called Toxic Shock about her own nearly fatal encounter with that disease. And she won the Pulitzer Prize in 1983 for that. I'm sorry, it was a magazine article, New York Times Magazine. She was the 3rd woman on the Times staff to win the Pulitzer. And then previous to that, she had covered the performing arts for the New York Times. She'd been in the Paris bureau covering everything, including the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. Before that, she covered the White House and Congress for the New York Times. And she has written a book that many of us have read called The Girls in the Balcony, Women, Men, and the New York Times. And we're going to hear from her in just a moment. I want to then introduce Gail Harris here on my left. Gail Harris is also an award-winning journalist. She is currently the anchor for the about-to-be-gone Monitor Channel, their nightly news presentation, Monitor News. But she has a terrific history, 20 years in the news business, and I'm sure someone in the audience will have a terrific job waiting for her when she's finished tonight. Before joining the Monitor Channel, she, of course, is well known to all of us for being on WGBH as the co-anchor of the 10 o'clock news before that died. And, of course, she worked for many years at ABC News' Nightline and World News Tonight. And perhaps best of all, she's a 1982 graduate of the Kennedy School of Government with a master's degree from here. Carol Rivers is a real entrepreneur and Renaissance woman. She's a journalist, a novelist, a screenwriter, and a professor of journalism at Boston University. And just to give you some idea of the range of her articles, one of them, Genetic Engineers, appeared in Ms. Magazine. Growing Up Catholic in the New York Times Magazine. The Vertigo of Homecoming, which is about Vietnam veterans, in The Nation. Sexual Harassment in Mother Jones. And this is my favorite one. Can a Woman Be Liberated and Married? For the New York Times Magazine. She's written novels and nonfiction books, and her perspective is always refreshing. And David Nyan, bless you for joining us tonight. David Nyan is the very courageous political columnist and associate editor of the Boston Globe, where I'm told as recently as a few hours ago by another caller from the Boston Globe, the women are in revolution at the moment. David writes 3 columns a week on politics and current affairs. He covered the last 6 presidential elections, and as assistant managing editor, he's run the newsroom. And so he has a lot to answer for if, in fact, things are not going well there. But David can always sneak back to Harvard because he actually graduated from here in 1962. So we let him get away with murder. But just before we turn to Nan, I just wanted to observe that while it seems that the women's movement has come a long way, the statistics show that a large majority of women in America think it's done more good for them than harm. I think Susan Faludi's book about backlash documents that our culture has this perception that women not only have gone too far, but that they're cocooning, returning to the home, and that feminism was a big mistake. And I think what we're learning as we study such trends and such issues as employment of women and minorities in the newsroom, that there's still a tremendously long way to go. I think also just the perceptions of some people, they still don't get it in some ways. I would like to just open by reading actually the last page of Nan Robertson's book. She's describing how Arthur Sulzberger, the young man who's now the publisher of the New York Times, he's just assumed the mantle from his father, also Arthur Sulzberger. Young Arthur was enthusiastically discussing the future of the New York Times in his 11th floor office with Penny Abernathy, who manages a $100 million budget for the paper's news staff of 1,000 people worldwide. During the conversation, young Arthur said to Penny, "I want to leave my son a different newspaper from the one I'm inheriting." Penny was thrilled. She went down to the 3rd floor where she and Carolyn Lee, her boss, occupy the northwest corner of the newsroom. She told Carolyn what Arthur had said. Carolyn smiled very sweetly. He had said, remember, "I want to leave my son a very different newspaper from the one I'm inheriting." Carolyn turned to Penny and said, "Did you mention to young Arthur that he also has a daughter?" I turn to you, Nan Robertson. Help us out here.
Okay. I have to tell you the epilogue to that final anecdote. When I was interviewing young Arthur about a year and a half ago, just after he had said that to Penny Abernathy, I recounted this anecdote back to him, and his face fell. It just crumbled, and he said, "I guess I haven't come as far as I thought I had." I thought that was very interesting, and it gave me a lot of hope for the future, that this young man is quite thoughtful about feminism and really does want to put his money where his mouth is. This is one of these books that had a title before I even began research. In a sense, I began research decades ago when I came to the Times at the age of 28. My hair had gone white before I left and took early retirement in 1988. I wanted a title that would somehow symbolize what lies within this book and yet have a larger connotation. And what I thought of right away was the ugliest symbol of discrimination against women in the world of journalism. It has historical resonance because of the blacks in the back of the bus, of women in purdah, of the blacks sitting in the balconies of movie theaters, of Orthodox Jewish women who still sit in the balconies of synagogues. But this was a real balcony, and I stood in that balcony, and so did Carol Rivers, and both of us have talked about it. The balcony was a narrow, hot place at the far end of the ballroom from the speaker's podium in the all-male National Press Club. The Press Club was founded shortly after the turn of the century, and for years women could not step across its threshold to cover any reporting events. After years and years of complaints from the Women's National Press Club, which was begun in Washington about 10 years thereafter, the officers of the club finally decided that they would open their premises to us. And so they said, you can stand in the balcony and you can listen to the world leaders who were then speaking very frequently at that club and giving important policy speeches. They would make a pit stop with the president at the White House, and then they would go on to an important luncheon at the National Press Club. So from 1955 until 1971, the women reporters who wished to cover the world leaders speaking at that club went to the balcony, and we stood there, jammed against one another, hot because the television lights were up there, angry, hungry. We had no lunch. We stared down at the men who were sitting on the floor, scarfing up their four-course meal, with their doctors and their dentists and the patent lawyers who worked in the National Press Club building. We were not allowed to ask questions, as the men did from the floor. And possibly the worst thing professionally, we could not hear very well. There was something about the acoustics of the ballroom and the fact that the speaker was at the other end. And finally, I am happy to report, Marjorie Hunter, one of the 3 women reporters, including myself, at the New York Times in the mid-60s, complained to Scotty Reston after she had stood in the back of the balcony on a rolled-up carpet, not being able to hear the speaker. And she said to Scotty Reston, who was then the bureau chief and one of the most idolized and admirable reporters in the world of Washington in that era, she said, she came back to the office, she stormed into Scotty's office and said, Scotty, don't you ever send me to that damn press club ever again. And Scotty turned to Wally Carroll, who was the news editor of the Bureau at that time, and he said, very wonderingly, Wally, what's wrong with Maggie? Maggie talked to him about this much later, and she said, you know, I don't think he understood even then what had made me so angry. And from then on, Maggie Hunter and I and Eileen Shanahan refused to accept assignments at the National Press Club, and it spread to women in other bureaus in Washington. That is the symbol of this book, of us in the balcony, not being part of the mainstream of our trade. But the reason I wrote this book was to add something to the record about the newspaper of record. It was a newspaper that I loved and that I worked for more than 3 decades. The women who sued it, who are the central figures in this book. It's about the whole history of the Times, from the 1850s to 1991, but the central drama of this is the sex discrimination suit against the New York Times, which was settled in favor of the women in 1978. I wanted to do honor to these women, to all of them, the brilliant individual exceptions that proved the rule, that women were not treated equally by this great institution and this newspaper that the women who sued it loved. I wanted to do that, to tell their stories. None of the big history books about the Times, not Meyer Berger's authorized history, not Gates Elise's compulsively readable Kingdom and the Power, not David Halberstam's book, The Powers That Be, not Harrison Salisbury's Without Fair or Favor. None of these books really take much notice of any of the women who throughout history have contributed to the book. So I wanted to do honor to these women. And I also wanted to give those who came after, who are coming after now into the newspaper business, want to tell them something of what went before, about these women who opened the doors for them. And I really, you know, a lot of people have gotten the message, a lot of young people have, which I think is wonderful. They now know really where they came from and why it is that they're in jobs that would have been inconceivable for women of my generation. And that, I think, is good. In San Francisco, a reporter was interviewing me while I was on my book tour, and she turned to me and she said, "You know, Nan," she said, "you have given us our begats. You have given us our history." And that made me feel very good indeed. And I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much.
Some of the statistics that appear not just in Nan Robertson's book, but in books like A Place in the News by Kay Mills. We had a forum with her some years ago. Some of you may have been here. Waiting for Prime Time by Marlene Sanders and Marcia Rock, which is also about this. And also from recent studies show that women are still way behind when it comes to powerful positions in the media, and it's not just because they're overlooked as the daughters of the heirs apparent. The Women, Men, and Media Project in California just recently announced that after looking at the front pages and local front pages of 20 newspapers during the month of February, they found that women, who are 52% after all of the population, show up 13% of the time in the prime news spots. And they are more often seen in bylines, in other words, they're writing the stories, than as the subjects of the news. Even with that, only two-thirds of the bylines on page one, two-thirds were male and one-third were female. And three-quarters of the opinion and op-ed pieces were by men. Less than a third of the pictures on page one were pictures of women. So I wonder, as we turn to Gail Harris, if the television business is any better.
Well. Let me say, first of all, if I may, that since my 10th reunion from the Kennedy School is coming up this weekend, what a special pleasure it is to be here with the serene satisfaction of knowing that I don't owe a term paper to anyone in the building. Secondly, thanks to Nan Robertson for writing an absolutely fabulous book. I think many of us who were there when the battles more recently were being fought worry sometimes that the women in their 20s and 30s in newsrooms all across the country may think that they're there by divine right and not because their older sisters and our older sisters kicked the doors in with some help. When I was growing up in Atlanta, it never occurred to me that one day I would be on television in a position of some seriousness and responsibility, because there was no such thing as a television anchor woman. I fell in love with the written word, and so I became a newspaper reporter. And after a couple of years of doing that, I began looking around and realizing that in the small suburban dailies that I was working for, that there was a section called the Women's Pages, and I began writing weddings and engagements and obits. I'm not sure if there's any parallel there, but it does teach you from an early age a great respect for accuracy. So I'm very happy that I had that experience, because you may not care whether the bride carried lily of the valley or rubrum lilies, but she will care passionately, and so will her mothers and her sisters and her cousins and her aunts. It was a good place to begin. At any rate, after a couple of years of doing that, however, I began to realize that I didn't want to spend my life writing weddings and engagements, and that there didn't seem to be much opportunity in areas other than the women's pages. And about that time, it was the early 1970s, the EEOC and the FCC were putting pressure on television stations to hire women. So I thought I would give that a try, and marched down to the television station in Tallahassee, Florida, which was where I was then living and working for the newspaper, with my clippings, and they hired me. I had no experience in broadcast. I hadn't the faintest idea what it was about. They gave me 2 days of training, and then they said, "You're the Georgia bureau chief. Half of our audience is in Georgia. Go thou and make television." And I attempted to do that, and it was quite an interesting experience. Going into the meetings with the South Georgia farmers at the Agricultural Association, and they kept waiting, I noticed, to start the meetings, and I guess what they assumed is that I was the photographer's girlfriend, because I finally asked someone why the meeting wasn't beginning, and he said, "Well, we're waiting for the reporter to show up." Of course, I wish I had had your grace and courage, Ellen, in making a similar comment, but I simply informed them with a straight face that that was my job. And eventually they, disbelieving, did start the meetings. From there, I was offered an opportunity in Charlotte, North Carolina, and in 1973, I became the first woman anchor in North Carolina. It's not exactly the dark ages when you think about it, but in 1973 there were no women anchors in that state. And in fact, when I was put on the air, management was very nervous and upset about what people would think about having a woman on the air. But they gulped, and they did it, and to their immense surprise, the audience thought that was a fine idea. Along the way, however, I must tell you that the thing that concerns me a great deal now is something that happened later in my career, and it took me a long time to figure it out, what was happening exactly. Because I began anchoring, I had been reporting and covering politics for any number of years as I was anchoring. So it wasn't just that I didn't exactly spend my days sitting in the studio waiting for someone to turn the lights on and combing my hair and so that I could read. I was always a reporter as well as an anchor, but I had never had anyone to learn anchoring from, since there were no other women, and I patterned myself on Walter Cronkite. And I remember along the way, from time to time, news directors saying to me, when they would see my work, "But you're so serious." And I would think, this is serious stuff that I'm doing. What do they mean I'm so serious? And it took me a very long time, over a period of years, to realize that what they really meant was the men were there to be serious. The women were there to be decorative. And it hasn't changed all that much. If you look at your local television broadcast, what you will find is that the women speak with a smile on their face all the time, even if they're telling you news that is fairly serious in its content. I found that one a little hard to deal with. It seems to me that if Arafat's plane disappears, that's not something you want to do with a smile on your face. At any rate, as I say, it took me a long time to figure out that was what they were really saying. And the time that I finally figured out that from their perspective, my purpose was to be decorative, that's when I said farewell to commercial television, went into public television very happily, where nobody commented on my hair and nobody expected me to smile through the serious news, and spent a number of very happy years in public television and then at ABC. And for the past year, it's been a terrific year and a couple of bad weeks. But for the past year, I've had the opportunity to write an hour-long broadcast of national and international news and analysis. And nobody has ever yet asked me why I don't smile. So it has been a good place for me to be. And I guess I will consider the battle won when not only is there a woman sitting next to Peter Jennings, but a woman who is able to feel the same confidence that a Jennings has in her writing style, let's start with that, to have the same kind of sass and wit and insight that he brings, and for her to feel as if those skills will be equally valued when she shows them to the audience as much as he does, and that she will not be judged on how her hair looks or whether she smiles in the serious stories.
We're going to hear from Carol Rivers next, and this may be unfair, but I always think of Carol as being in the real cutting edge of the women who have really fought for women's rights, but who are also still angry. I don't know if you're still angry, Carol, but I thought I would hold this up in your honor as well as some others. It's about the New York primary, but I think it applies as well to the women who teach at Boston University. Thank you.
Well, everybody at BU sort of grins and grits our teeth at the same time. It's an interesting environment. It's nice to see Gail on television, at least it was nice to see Gail on television, being both alone and authoritative up there, because if you'll notice, most anchor teams look like some guy and his second wife. I'd like to talk a little bit about the culture of journalism, which is what Nan Robertson's book is really about. And while Nan indeed has done history, she's also talking about things that still exist. Journalism as a business is, and has been for a long time, the $6 word is androcentric. The common sense explanation for that is it's male-centered. It's about men's ways of competing, talking, relating, and managing. That's the normal. And other things are abnormal. And I think it's more difficult and more subtle than sexism, because sexism is as if there's sort of guys there who are out to get you and do you in. And I think, in fact, that there's certainly some of that around. There's probably lots of that around. But more of what happens is that you have people who accept the world the way it is and find a different idea for the way the world ought to be, sort of peculiar. For example, one of the things you run into as a journalist is the fact that women aren't listened to. And this starts real early. Think of the way that women's talk is described. We gossip, we prattle, we chatter. That's rarely said about men. And if any of you saw the Jane Pauley special last night on television, which showed a very caring, loving teacher in a classroom pointing beyond a lot of little girls in the 5th grade who had their hands up, calling continually on the boys in the back, and constantly going to the boys and engaging them in conversation and saying to the little girls, "That's fine, dear, that's good." What you understand is that women get the message very early that what they say isn't important. And men, I think, tend to have spent a lot of years writing women off and tuning out when they speak, whether it's their mothers when they nagged them to put on their galoshes, or girlfriends who nagged that they want to go see movie X by Bergman instead of Rambo. And I think that becomes ingrained. And a friend of mine who was on the editorial board at a major American daily says that at the meetings, what she sees happening is that it's like a tape is running, she's the only woman in the room, and everybody listens. When it comes to her, the tape stops. Everybody's polite. Nobody says anything, but after she's done speaking, the tape starts. And the guy 3 down from her makes the exact same point she's made, and then the conversation begins. It's as if she didn't say anything. And I think this is a lot of what you run into, whether you're a woman in journalism trying to propose a story, or whether you're at the city editor level trying to convince your city, or whether you're in a meeting trying to say, hey, this is a story. Another thing I think that happens is when you're in a very male world, the normal ways of being, people think of managing editors, they think of city editors, they think of Washington correspondents as men. And when you get up high in the levels of journalism, it's not whether you're competent or not. If you're looking for the title of managing editor or some other title, there's probably 5 to 10 people who are competent. The issue is fit. How comfortable are you going to be? How comfortably are the other managers going to be with you? And at another major daily, there was a situation in which there was an opening for one of the editors of the main sections, and a guy who had been the editor was leaving, and there were 2 women in their mid-30s who were generally regarded as superb by everybody. Lo and behold, they don't get appointed to the job. What they get is a 27-year-old man who gets the job. And some of the women on the paper went to the editor-in-chief and said, "Why did you do this?" And he sort of scratched his head and he said, "Well, I appointed him because he reminded myself of me at that age." So there was no way, it wasn't that he didn't like the women, but there's sort of no way that he could have looked at those women and said, "That's me," and had that kind of sense of mentoring the women. Another thing you run into is that as a woman or as a minority, you have an agenda, whereas blacks have an agenda, Hispanics have an agenda, but white guys don't have an agenda. And this is true that when my friend Carolyn Toll Oppenheim, who I think is here, was working on a Chicago daily, it was very interesting that before she had a baby, she was covering children and their issues and abuse and stuff like that. And when she had a baby, they told her she couldn't cover that anymore because she now was not objective, now that she was a mother. You wonder, before she had the baby, she would write stories saying, on the one hand, children should really not be abused. On the other hand, they could really be rotten, so you got to slap them around a little bit. I can't imagine an editor saying to a man who had children, you can't cover issues of children because you're not objective. Blacks get this. A lot of blacks have been told you can't be sent to Africa because you can't cover blacks. You'll be, do they take some guy named Sven and say you can't go to Sweden? White guys cover white guys all the time. It's only considered odd if women cover women or blacks cover blacks. Another thing that you run into is that the world that's real is the world of the games white guys play, and the other stuff is dressing. I remember being at the convention in 1984 when Jerry Ferraro had just been, it was just announced that Jerry Ferraro was going to be the vice presidential nominee. The women in that auditorium, activists, journalists, everybody, were absolutely thrilled. There was such euphoria going through that auditorium. This was a historical first. At the same time, there was this battle going on over whether Burt Lance was going to get on the Democratic National Committee. It was this typical inside baseball, crummy, piddling little fight, which nobody cared about unless you were, the absolute political junkie. And I remember a national columnist came out with a headline story that said, "Clouds of doom hung over the Moscone Center," because of this little battle. And I was saying, where was this man? What I was seeing was an utterly different reality of absolute euphoria, a sense of history. And if there were clouds of doom, it was like 7 guys in the DNC in the back room. And yet this became the story. And I think you're always finding yourself arguing against this. You're always trying to justify yourself. You're always trying to say, I'm not weird. And sometimes you're saying to yourself, am I weird? Is it me? And you have to say to yourself, no, it isn't me. It's just that my way of looking at things is sometimes different. It may not be better, but it's different. And that's legitimate. And I'd also just like to say a couple of things about coverage of women. Because I see 2 things happening at the same time, sort of 2 mythologies about women, which are cropping up in a lot of the current coverage. The first is the myth of female weakness, which is that women are these crazed, hormonal, strange people that are going to do bizarre things. In the 19th century, it was seriously believed that women's brains and reproductive system couldn't develop at the same time, that if they did too much intellectual stuff, they wouldn't be able to have babies. I mean, that was real dogma. And you now see that every story that suggests that women are bizarre or hormonal or strange pops right into the headlines. And PMS had 30 minutes on Nightline. Now, how many women do you know who, before their periods really run out and hack people in the neighborhood to death? And yet, that becomes a story. And however, when a guy walks into McDonald's and shoots everybody because the burgers were cold, nobody says, God, testosterone poisoning. What are we going to do about these men? When math genes was a big story, if you remember the story about women testing lower on math ability, turned out to be a terribly flawed study, but headlines all over, are women innately inferior in math? First of all, the study was skewed, but secondly, when you looked at the study, what it showed was that Asian males outperformed whites all over the place. And you never saw one headline that said, are whites inferior to Asians? It didn't exist. And so you find that stories mommy track, there's a whole batch of them, which every time a story comes up that suggests that women can't do something or inferior, they jump to the headlines, and good news about women gets buried on page 23 under the meat market. At the same time, there's this sort of myth of female strength, that if you let women anywhere near power, awful things are going to happen. My favorite headline was Don Feder calling Hillary Clinton Eva Perón. And that's the king. Don't cry for me, Little Rock, why is it that first ladies, people get absolutely bent out of shape? When you look at the terrible things they've done, Lady Bird beautified the highways, and Rosalind tried to help mental health. You look at everything the first ladies have done, and it's been usually pretty positive. Nobody's worried about the guys around the president who have done terrible things. They've sold missiles to the wrong people. They've been corrupt. They've done awful things. But everybody worries about women near power, and they don't worry at all about men near power. So Anita Hill was the example of, at the very same time, Anita Hill was either weak, a tool, driven by her hormones because she desperately loved this man and she had to do something. So she's either this weak hormonal creature, or on the other hand, she was this vendetta, this vengeful, scorned woman who read The Exorcist to try to invent all sorts of stuff. And she was presented as both at the same time. I said, come on, guys, give me a break. Either she's one or she's the other. And we don't seem to learn. Every time these things come up and women come into the headlines, the same mythologies keep going over and over. And I think that the good thing is that it's changing as we get more and more women into positions of authority. Women are going to be seen as less of the other than they are. But we still have a long way to go before we get out of that particular balcony, as Nan says.
If there's any man who's equal to the moment at hand, it is my friend David Nyan. But I'm afraid, David, that I just have to introduce you with one little news item. Some of you may have noticed that there's now an all-woman news show. It's a new talk show. It's, of course, one of these Washington Insider things, but Nina Totenberg is on it, and so forth and so on. And one of the things that was said about it that I thought was interesting that I wanted to pose to David is they said that you won't hear us, these women, discussing whether Clayton Yiter's getting along with Sam Skinner or who got a crummy table at the White House mess. You will hear no football analogies on this show. So I want to ask David that as he answers the very difficult question of if things are really this bad, why are they so bad? Why are women feeling this way? As you answer that, and make your remarks, could you pledge to us that for the next 5 columns you will use no sports analogies?
Maggie Marshall said to me on the way over, she said, "So you're the token girl." I just want to be treated equal. I don't want to be treated worse. This is true. Ellen Hume asked Nan, before we came out here, would it be okay if I quote from the last page of your book to tell a little anecdote? And Nan said, fine, I love it, go ahead. So Ellen asked permission of Nan. Now, what do I have here? I'm the mop-up, right? I have to wait till they talk. One of my lines is, read that, Ellen. I am racking my brain for sports analogies, which I will be careful not to use, and you take my opener. Thanks a bunch. First of all, I bring greetings to the group from my close personal friends, Senator Orrin Hatch and Senator Alan Simpson. Say hello to the girls, they said. And by the way, there's always a guy in the second row who wants to make sure he gets the first question. Sir, I am entertaining no questions from males this evening in honor of Carol Rivers. My friend and colleague from the Globe, Marty Nolan, came here 2 years ago and did this shtick. And I said to him, what's it like, Nolan? He said, Nyan, he said, I was the suckling pig with the apple in my mouth. He said, you'll have a wonderful time. When I heard Carol talk about how, supposedly white guys have no agenda, that reminded me of a line of Marty's, which is, we were in a discussion one time with a large group of people about affirmative action. And Nolan just said, very casually, muttered it as an aside, I don't even know if he's ever written it, he said, when affirmative action was used for the advantage of white guys, I don't recall hearing any of these beefs. I think he's right. It did work for white people, for white males, and it's in the process now of being employed for women. There are a lot of people who did not have the advantages that the remedies that are available to some women today, not to all of them. you know, I look around this room and I see some people that I've known over the years, some people that have worked here. Dean Lord, an old pal of mine and colleague. I know from the diplomatic world, Barbara Ekus, a friend of mine, is here tonight. And Madeline Kunin, whom you knew as a governor in Vermont, a terrific governor, is here. And there's also a woman who's been through a lot, who is just a friend that I met tonight for the first time. This is Margaret Ray, who wrote the stories Curious George. Would you say hello? Margaret, stand up right here. She's shy. She's too shy to stand up. Let me tell you, I sat next to this woman at dinner, and there's nothing shy about this lady. Ellen asked me just to sort of respond to a couple of points that were made before you all get your chance. And the first note I wrote on my page during Nan Robertson's talk, and I read her book, I enjoyed her book. One of the parts I liked best was the capsule biographies of women reporters, some of whose names I didn't even know. I mean, Nellie Bly, yes, and all that. But there were some terrific tales about women who were extremely competent that were very heartening to me to read. But I must take issue with the verb scarfing. She talked about that press club and the people in the balcony. By the way, how hot is it up there? And did any of you eat? And she cited Carol River as a fellow sufferer up there in the balcony. And when I heard about these men scarfing up their meals, I thought, first of all, who did I ever know that went to the press club to eat? Secondly, I said scarfing, and Carol said, yes, scarfing. So I begin the serious part of my remarks with an apology for the table manners of all those gentlemen journalists of the mid-'60s. There's another friend of mine here tonight. I haven't seen her, but I think she's here, Loretta McLaughlin, who works at the Globe. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I hope it's okay, Loretta. Can I tell that story? Loretta has been through the wars, as have you all. And at one point in her career, she was working for the Hearst paper in Boston. And when I told her I was coming over here tonight, she said, she told me this story. And it was, she said, the great thing about the Hearst paper was the next person in line got the assignment for some reason. So the city editor one day at the Hearst tab says, Loretta, go over to Harvard. I assume it was the Briggs Cage. You remember the old baseball facility here? And Richard Nixon was addressing a mealtime dinner audience of 5,000 Republican men. And the men were in there scarfing up their victuals.
I'll never use it again.
Yes, actually, being Republicans, I think they probably knew which fork to use, unlike the gentlemen of the press. And Loretta is lined up to go in, and she's standing next to a fellow who I happen to work with, who broke me in at the Associated Press when I worked for the AP many years ago. Cornelius F. Hurley, Connie Hurley, well known to many people, you probably remember. And at the last minute, one of the security detail for this Nixon speech, as Loretta started to shuffle her way into this audience to record the Nixon speech, said, you can't go in there, sorry, no woman allowed. And at that point, said Loretta, Connie Hurley and a couple other of the Boston newspaper people picked me up by the elbows and just whisked me inside, and Hurley shouted over his shoulder to the security detail, she's not a woman, she's a newspaper man. Loretta told me that story as an example of the ire, the anger, the fury that women feel when they're denied an opportunity to practice their craft. And in response, I told her a story that happened to me when I was a young fellow. I was in the Air Force. I was an enlisted man. And my regular job was driving a truck, which was very dull work. So because I had some experience in the newspaper business, I got the fellow who ran the base newspaper to give me a little extra job writing stories, and I used them in which to sort of wheedle out from driving a gasoline truck on a runway. And one day I was told, Airman Nyan, go on over to the officers' club at the base, and General Barry Goldwater, who just run for president and got creamed, was coming to give a speech. Said, "You go cover General Goldwater's speech, then you come back. Airman, you write up an article for the base newspaper." "Yes, sir, I certainly will. I'll do it." And I went over there in my green fatigues with my 2 stripes in my sleeve, and some fat, evil-eyed technical sergeant at the door said, "You can't go in there, Airman. This is the officers' club. No enlisted men allowed." And I said, "Beautiful, Sarge. See you later." And I screwed. We never had the story. And it was an example of being denied an opportunity to practice my craft with, I should say, some degree of relish. When I read Nan's book, it reminded me of a couple of things. It reminded me how important mentoring is to every newsperson's career, not just older, more successful women with younger women, but more successful people generally with younger people generally. Mentoring is extremely important. I have benefited by it greatly. I try to put some of it back in the business, as do many, as do some of the people here. I was disappointed when I read that book to read how 2 of the most successful women at the New York Times did not sign on with the brave women who risked career, who risked being blocked and impeded in their career path. And it's very clear to me that, as often in legislative fights in Congress, I think of what happened to William Fulbright in Vietnam, and I think of some other legislators whose careers have been blighted by being too far out in front. I think the woman that Nan wrote about, this Betsy Wade, whom I do not know, and other people, they were real heroes. They were giants. We hear about, you know, the Anna Quindlen who won the Pulitzer Prize, and all these younger people, Maureen Dowd, a gifted writer, and so forth. But it was the people, the older people, who made the sacrifices, and who I think largely did not get the rewards. I think it's astonishing that, am I right on the figure that the cash settlement was $450 a piece, something like that?
Just about.
That is the amount of a dinner tab for a New York Times woman in Washington taking 2 people out to dinner. That's what they settled for. In a way, I kind of wish they had gone to court. I wish they'd burned them. I understand the psychic damage that comes from carrying a suit to fruition, and maybe it worked out for the best. Certainly things have improved. The final thing I want to say is it's all about power. Who gets jobs in journalism, what they do with the jobs, who gets the title. It's about power. And this is true for people whose skin is not white. It's for people whose sexual identity does not fall into column A or column B. It's true for white males as well. It's all about power. And I look forward with some trepidation to the question period. I didn't come here to get kicked around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I knew you were equal to the task. You had a rather long introduction, but when you cut to the chase, it was terrific. Thank you. We're ready now to have you line up at the microphones, questions for these people. I'd like to pose the first one while you get up your whatever to get to the microphone. I'm interested, starting with Nan, I guess, in the idea that having women in the newsroom in positions of authority as reporters, as editors, and in television also, whether that really makes a difference to coverage. There was one study that found that when Marianne Dolan ran the L.A. Herald, that really the coverage of women did not change much, the use of women as reporters did not change much, hiring didn't change much. Is there an argument to be made that, that having women in the media will change the way women are treated in the news, or do they just turn into men?
I think it is changing already. There were many topics that were considered women's topics. Just to give one recent example of a story that probably would have been ignored only a few years ago, was the coverage of the silicone gel breast implant research scandals. Now that made page one of most newspapers in America, including the New York Times, it probably would have been ignored. I talked to David Jones, who was for many years the national editor of the Times. He was known as the Phil Spitalny of the New York Times, which is a sort of ageist comment about Phil Spitalny ran an all-girl orchestra, and David hired a lot of women onto the national desk of the Times and found almost immediately that certain kinds of stories that would have been ignored or just sort of talked over by men, that isn't worth anything, and women say, no, this is a hell of a story, that they really are, that the much greater numbers of women editors at newspapers, including the Times, it's now about a third of all the copy editors at the Times are women, that is definitely making a change in the kind of coverage. And it's true with other newspapers as well.
Yeah, I think there's a study that's out of UC Irvine done by a researcher out there on corporations, and I think it's true in journalism, showing that the first wave of women managers tend to try to be imitation men. They try to say, I'm as tough, my style is going to be just right, I'm going to fit in. When the numbers start to increase and more women start getting in, the second wave of women who get into power feel more comfortable with assigning stories that they're really interested in instead of saying, I'm a hard-nosed news person, I can only be interested in these. So I think numbers make a difference.
Definitely.
David, have you observed any difference in having women as reporters?
Well, maybe this is not the answer that the audience wants, but I think talent is more important than gender. And
What is more important?
talent.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And that when you're running a news operation, whether it's men or women, there's tremendous pressure on it. These are very difficult jobs. You have to go in clicking. Can I just tell one anecdote? I happened to spend some time with Paul Tsongas after he won New Hampshire. In the morning, just before he was going on television with Brinkley, the Sunday of the main caucuses, and he was hot as a pistol, and he knew it was really going, and he thought in that week, and maybe for a week after, he was going to possibly be president. And if you recall, it was the time of the Olympics, and we're walking down the corridor to where he's going to do an important TV event. And I have known him over the years and had talked to him, and I said, Paul, I said, you've got to feel like one of those luge riders in the Olympics. I said, you just strap that scrawny little sled onto your ass and you hold on and hope you don't go, hope you don't kill yourself at the bottom. That's what it's like. And he said, yeah, he said, and you hope you make it. You don't go off in the first turn. And then he goes on to do the Brinkley show. But that kind of pressure, he talked about how things come at you. He said, you don't have time to react. You just have to, it's like playing a video game. And being a news executive is like that. And this is why I don't think that any degree of earnest recommendations from well-meaning people can really come to bear. News executives, I think it's probably worse in television than it is in a newspaper. And at a great paper like the Times, you have better backup. You have better people all around you. But it is hard as hell for these people. And I guess one thing I've learned not to do, having sat in those seats and sometimes making decisions that afterwards I just felt crushed about. But, you're flying on instinct. And it undoubtedly is true, as all the panelists here would agree, and I mean all of us, me too, that you'd like to have a woman's viewpoint in the mix or calling the shots or whatever. But I come down on the side that still talent will outdistance gender in the long run. It's very difficult to run a news operation fairly.
Thank you. And Gail?
The one thing I would add to that is that David was absolutely correct when he said it's all about power. The great thing about being an anchor after years of reporting and anchoring is that when you get to a certain position, you have a certain amount of power. Now, you can use that to get a refrigerator for your office, or you can use it to suggest strongly that certain stories be covered. And I find that that's one of the heartening things about working for a program like the 10 o'clock news for GBH or the program that I'm doing now, is that I feel very comfortable making those suggestions, and it happens. And that's one of the good things about being in that position. I would say also, however, that many of the battles are being fought in management, because when women are in management, I do think it makes a difference. And I'll cite one example. There was a time when those of us who were trudging our way through the television ranks wondered what would happen when we reached the magic age of 40. Because women, as men aged, they got gray-haired and distinguished, and women simply got wrinkly. What we're finding is that now, at the network level particularly, perhaps less so with a few notable exceptions on the local level, but at the network level, I think because there are some women in management, and perhaps some men are getting a little more enlightened as well, they're coming to understand that having a Cokie Roberts on the Hill, who knows the place inside and out, is far more important than what her age is. And there are several other examples I could cite. So I think that there's a two-sided battle. One of them has to be fought in the anchor chair, and the other battle has to be fought in the manager's office.
Thank you. I think we're ready with our first question.
First of all, does luging count as a sports analogy? I don't know.
Could you please identify yourselves when you ask your question?
Hi, my name
Obviously a bobsledder, right?
Hi, my name is Tom Regan. The woman I live with said to me today that she knew that real equality would occur when women would be able to be as incompetent as men and still keep their jobs. And I was sort of curious to find out if the people on the panel thought that, is this still true? Is there still a sense that women still have to work in journalism, twice as hard, still be twice as good in order to be sort of looked at as the same level as many of the male reporters and editors that they have to work with?
Sir, I would submit that it varies even within organizations. It can vary department to department and task to task.
I also have a sense that at entry level things are pretty even. That the young woman who graduates today with a degree in journalism is going to probably be treated very much the same as the young man. Where I think things change is as you move up the ladder and you run into the proverbial glass ceiling. I think that a woman I can even talk about women talking among ourselves for a position that was open, and that we were talking about certain women we wanted to contact, and the issue always came up, God, we've got to go in with somebody who's super, or they'll shoot us down. And that was not the same when we talked about the male candidates. So is it still true? It's certainly still true in a lot of people's minds.
Anybody else? Nan?
Yes, I think we still have to struggle. I mean, we're half the population, right? There's no culture gap. There's no education gap. When young Arthur Sulzberger examined the payrolls at the New York Times in 1988 when he became deputy publisher, he found out that basically what we had known, we in the caucus had known for a long time, that men at the Times were willing to give us everything except real money and real power. The salary gap on the average between men and women on the news side of the New York Times in 1988 was $13,000 a year. And on the business side, it was $25,000 a year. Now, that is not fair. And unlike his father, a decent, genial, wonderful guy in many ways, Punch Sulzberger did not lean on his managers to say, we've got to do something about this. He did not do that, and that is why the Women's Caucus, representing all the women at the time, sued. But young Arthur Sulzberger has leaned on his managers and has now closed the gap in new hires on the news side and is down to $7,000 a year on the business side. I still think it's a disgrace that that was true within this great institution in 1988, that had to be done. So I still think we have to struggle. We're nothing like half the, just to cite numbers, we're nothing like half the staff of the Times. And we're getting there, but boy, I feel like that middle-aged woman that I saw sort of waving a placard in the back of the National Women's Political Caucus convention a few years ago, and she was waving it back and forth, and had great big letters. Remember that Virginia Slims article? I mean, not the article, the ad about "You've come a long way, baby." Well, this middle-aged lady was waving her placard, and she said, "We haven't come far enough, and don't call me baby."
Gail, did you want to comment?
The only thing I would say is probably. On the other hand, I can't think of any incompetent women with whom I work, because incompetence doesn't last long. And you get to a certain level, and whether it's male or female, they're not going to be there very long. But I would say that, on average, that I have probably worked with men whose skills were somewhat less than the women's skills I've worked with.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I'm Teresa Bourgeois. Last Wednesday, the Globe had a forum that they advertised quite a bit. It was a forum on 92 presidential election, and there were 4 white men on the panel. Last night, CBS Evening News did a special from 11:30 to 12, and of all of the pundits and the journalists who commented, only one of them was not a white male. It was Susan Spencer from the White House. It was late at night, so she probably got stuck with late duty. There was no one there. In both cases, I called and said, if this was a forum that was all women, it would be advertised as a women's perspective on the 92 election. If it was a forum that was minorities, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, it would have been advertised as a minority viewpoint on the 92 election. So at what point are they going to either advertise it as white guys' view on the minority election?
Can I answer that?
Please
Since
do.
it's directed at me. First of all, you weren't there.
No, I wasn't.
And the reason you weren't there is because we did have a woman on the panel.
I called the day
And the
before. When was
reason-
she added?
The reason she was on the panel, Renee Loth, was because I told the Globe I wouldn't chair the panel unless there was a woman added.
Well,
She
right
was
there.
Oh,
added.
thank you. No, you're right.
I don't say this to put down your general points.
I
okay,
was
just
quite-
a specific point, and I think there were probably some people here who were there. Renee was there. She was added. Her name did not appear in the House ad, which was prepared by one of our women executives, I should add, at the Globe. It may be helpful just if I talk about some numbers in general, and
But can I
I
ask
mean
you-
no disrespect. I
No,
take
no,
your
I'm sorry.
point.
I was ill, actually. I couldn't go. But you had said it's instinct. You know, it's very fast-paced, and it's instinct. So what I'd like to know is, at what point does it become instinct that a panel of all white men, and I stand corrected, or a newscast with only one woman and no diversity, is just instinctively not the right thing to have?
Well, all I can tell you is that this kid's instinct has been sensitized, and I took care of that. And the Globe in general, and I think there are probably a lot of people here who are interested in the numbers. I checked before I came over. We have 1,000 white-collar employees at the Globe, 42% of them female. In the last 4 years, since management got the word, and I think, you know, belatedly, the way Times Management got the word, 44% of all promotions in the white-collar section have gone to women, just very slightly more than their 42% of the jobs they hold. On the management side, 26% of the managers are female, 74% are male. The men have an overwhelming advantage in length of service, and I'm sure that the pay scale would be similarly skewed. But in the last 4 years, the period for which the Globe management would like to be measured, 33% of all management promotions have gone to women, which so 26% of the managers are women, but they get 33% of the promotion. And there is a glass ceiling there. There's a prominent, you know, the Labor Council is a woman, the Corporate Council is a woman, there's a woman who runs the Personnel Department, there's one woman director out of about a dozen. The lead managing editor is a woman, the deputy editor of the editorial page is a woman, the night news editor who determines what goes into the paper is a woman, national editor female, city editor female, assistant foreign editor, specialist editor, and various associate editors and things like that. So progress has been made. I would have to say that a great deal more progress has been made on behalf of women than has been made on behalf of racial minorities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, David. I'd like to add in defense of that also that your city editor is, what is Greg Moore's title now?
He is I think a deputy managing
editor. A person of some power at your paper is black, and that's been noticed. And also the New York Times national editor, Soma Golden, is a woman. Mm-hmm. So again, these things are happening.
Ellen,
yes,
just
Carol?
to point out that it's not always men who fall into this trap of seeing sort of white guys as the normal people to comment on the world. There was, in the past year, a proposal to set up a sort of women's panel in which women would comment, and the producer was a woman. The name Jean Kirkpatrick was suggested, and she was rejected as being not attractive enough. So women, I mean, does anybody say about George Shultz, hey, George, you got to lose 20 pounds and trim those eyebrows, big guys. It doesn't happen.
Okay. We have a question over here.
My name is Katya Heder, and I'm a first-year student in the MPP program. I'm wondering, as I enter my summer news internship this summer, if you have any advice for me.
You're going to be at the Wall Street Journal
Yes.
and the Houston Bureau, I believe.
Okay, man, you give advice.
Working for a woman bureau chief. Right.
Working for a woman's bureau chief.
Yes.
Very good.
Who hired her as an intern.
Yeah. You're an intern? You're going to be an intern?
I think I'll be working with men also, though, I believe.
Yeah.
With what? I'm sorry, I didn't.
She'll be working with men also.
Just listen. Listen and see how it is there, and stand up for yourself calmly. Have self-respect for yourself, but do listen. You've got a lot to learn. You're young. It's a wonderful vocation or trade or business, whatever you want to call it. I had a marvelous time in the business, almost 40 years. That's what I have to tell you. Okay?
You're lucky to have a job in this business. The industry has been contracting, and it's a terrific opportunity. The Wall Street Journal is the first paper I pick up every morning. I admire a great deal about what they do. The Daily Diary of the American Dream. The male elite power structure of this country reads it. They bragged of their slightly less than 2 million circulation. The average family income, or median family income, is $104,000. It is the paper of the power structure in this country. Their editorials are far less enlightened towards women and a lot of other things than the New York Times or most any other paper I could think of, south of Manchester. And I would say this, that it's a great business. It's a terrific thing to get into. I'm just sorry that opportunities are contracting and that there are, in fact, 20,000 fewer newspaper jobs in this country than there were 2 years ago. But I would say when you're worried about dealing with male colleagues, the biggest sin that I have and that has been pointed out to me by women I work with and women I live with is the tendency of men to interrupt women. And I'm still working on it, and believe me, that would be one very practical tip I would give you, just to be able to say to your bureau chief or your colleagues, excuse me, when you're through interrupting me, I'd like to continue my thought. That would have done great for me if I'd learned it.
Yeah, it's very good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Terrific. Catherine?
Catherine Kinderman. The cover story of Time magazine this week is sex and psychotherapy. There's no question that it came out of the headlines of the Boston newspapers for the last 3 or 4 days, and I wonder why it had to, this very important story came through a woman psychiatrist as opposed to the kind of issues that have been going around a male psychiatrist and sex therapy for the last X amount of years. Could you comment on that?
Maybe Carol should comment on that. Yeah.
Yeah, the same reason that the cover story of Newsweek on Leona Helmsley said, "What rhymes with rich?" Now, in fact, Leona Helmsley cheated a little bit on her income tax, right? She didn't steal anything. The big guys on Wall Street stole zillions. They ruined people, and yet there was no story saying what rhymes with bastard. I think nothing rhymes with bastard, right? Maybe that's the problem. But I do think, again, when women transgress, because the idea is that women are supposed to be sort of the moral police. When women transgress, it's a big story. If this had been a male story and a male psychiatrist had seduced a young woman and she had committed suicide, it would be a story. These are always stories, but I suspect it would in no way would have been played as big a story as the one. Whenever there is a woman who is the transgressor, because it is seen as unnatural for women to be in that role, it becomes an enormous story.
Ellen?
Alleged transgressor.
Yes.
That was going to be my question, too. Outside of the Persian Gulf War, I don't ever remember seeing the Globe give so much space, starting on the first page so often, repeating the whole story with each new version over and over again, sometimes whole pages on that story. And I had a conversation today over at the Ed School, and we were talking about this. Now, I happen to know from my own personal background of some Boston stories. I mean, it's been in the paper. You know, Dr. Ziegelbaum, they were after him for 12 years before they took away his license, and he's now practicing in Washington State. That got us a couple small articles in the back of the first section. This thing has become an obsession in the Globe. People are learning more about psychoanalytic theory and transference and countertransference and the fantasies of therapists than they ever wanted to know. And
Ziegelbaum is jealous, I'm sure.
I'm sure, but I have to tell you that there is something so blatant about just the sheer position and space and repetition in the Globe.
May I respond to that?
I'll take that as your question. Go ahead, David.
Okay, I think I get the drift. See me afterwards. I have a list of about 22 women editors at the Globe to whom you can direct your inquiries. And I would also distance myself from my co-panelist, Carol, on the sense that I think what really made this story was the documentation provided by the family of the young fellow who committed suicide. And I would bet you, and I know I'm paddling uphill against a lifetime of prejudice and bias and so forth, so I'm not going to ask you to accept what I say on faith, but I'm sure that if we had the same kind of documentation or alleged documentation provided by the family of the deceased, and if it was a girl or a young woman who committed suicide and a male shrink who had engaged in what is alleged to be questionable practice, I think you would have seen the same amount of stuff. So don't allow the thousands and thousands of examples of prejudice to force you to conclude that in every case the women are getting screwed. I would submit to you there were sound journalistic reasons probably made by a series of these women editors whose titles I ticked off a few moments ago.
Can I disagree, David, on that for a minute? It's a story, no question about it. But I suggest that there are a number of stories involving male psychiatrists where there are living women who are testifying, 5, 6, 7, 8, who are testifying this happened. Why is that less documentation than the allegations of a family who have real reasons to be biased in this case?
The answer I would give is the sheer volume of notes, the documentary evidence.
Okay. I think we need to move on. Yes.
Hi, I'm Regina Vorbach-Bogle. I'm very grateful that you women are here and that you have kicked down some doors.
Thank David, too. He's been very heroic. Yeah.
I'm very grateful to you, too.
And I, Regina, am grateful that you are grateful.
What I'd like to just ask you to comment on, I worked in a production company several years ago. I work in video production. And the joke with the rest of the women on the staff was, well, if you mention it to the manager, it will come up in the department meeting and it'll be his idea. How do you move beyond that? Or how do you, I guess, clarify your ideas enough or get yourself heard enough? Is it maturity? Is it degree of experience that you can say, this is my idea and I'm presenting it to the department?
I'd like to weigh in and say that is not necessarily gender related.
Yeah.
I think that's just being a junior staff person. Would you all agree with me?
Yes.
Yeah. So what you're talking about happens across gender and race lines, and you just have to get into power yourself.
Just keep going for it. All right.
Keep fighting.
Ellen, do you and Marvin have anything you want to share with us here?
Absolutely not. Yes.
My name is Amy Iorio, and my question is both to Ms. Rivers and Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris is our one broadcast journalist. My question, which Ms. Rivers touched on a little bit with the question of talking about Schultz's looks, is 40 may not be the barrier, but you're a very attractive woman. And what I see as the barrier still for broadcast journalists is that attractive women can make it above a certain age level, but that unattractive women never make it, and that unattractive men, it's simply not an issue. And where are we in terms of that changing and that becoming a non-issue in our society?
I have a terrible feeling that the gender gap is narrowing and men are getting the bad end of the stick. I mean, you look at the male anchors on the networks now, they're all very good-looking guys. I think that there's a culture of attractiveness which, even though women still suffer more, I think that maybe it's spreading, and men are getting it too. And I think that's. Do you think so, Gail?
I do, although I would also say you should see me without my makeup on. It's fairly amazing what that can do. But no, your point is well taken. I mean, the first thing that happens when you walk into a television newsroom is you get told to gain weight, lose weight, cut your hair, color your hair, go out with a wardrobe person, etc. And you're right. Which to me is one of the real problems with it. The focus is on the wrong things. Ask me about my writing. Ask me about my reporting. Ask me about how well I can conduct an interview. But unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that, because I certainly noticed it in my days in commercial TV that if you have a piece of hair that's doing this, nobody cares what you're saying at that moment. They're watching to see what the piece of hair is going to do next.
It's true.
And so that's just one of the realities of a visual medium. But I agree with you. I think that the men are probably getting nudged more and more toward the same cult of whatever.
Yeah, some of my friends who were older male television reporters in Washington are getting facelifts, and I think that's really a shame. Why they have to do that?
There's also the question of being aggressive. I remember I was supposed to anchor a program on Channel 2 a few years back, and as I went on, it was about women's issues. The president of the station, who I'd never met before, was waiting for me as I went, and he said, "Now you're not going to be too aggressive, are you?" And I thought, wait a minute. I'm this nice mommy. I'm not really this nasty person. And he said, "Now you'll really be nice, and you'll sort of soft pedal it." Later I thought of the great remark. I was going to say, "Yes, Stan, I think we'll wipe out the castration segment if that's going to make you feel better." But it was astonishing that anybody would see me as this. I thought of myself as
I don't know, Carol. You come on pretty strong.
Thank you.
Okay, you're next.
Good evening. My name is P.J. McNeely, and during my undergraduate career at BC, I wrote on the sports staff that had the first woman sports editor in the history of the paper. And now that I'm at BU getting my master's in Professor Rivers' program, I do not have her in class. I'm not brown-nosing. I find that I'm outnumbered almost 5-to-1 women to men in the program. And I don't know if this is a sign of the times. I know that I'm back in school because I couldn't get a job. But I would also like to think that there's a higher goal for being there. I'm also looking to go into sports. But I look at what's happening in the field, and I also realize that I want to do news, and that's part of the reason why I'm in school. But if you look at women in the sports field, you look at what in the wake of, which is still happening, of Lisa Olson. How much does that still hurt, and how much does that still, say, inhibiting women, do you think, from still going to sports?
One of the interesting things I can tell you, Melissa Ludke isn't here now, but she was here earlier. She was the person who was the original suer when she worked. She sued when she worked. Excuse me, when she worked for Time Life for Sports Illustrated, and it was her suit that opened the locker rooms. And what's so interesting is the misperception of what she was trying to do. She was trying to interview the players and the coaches, and they were in the locker room. So the women, like herself said to the managers of the sport, as baseball, they said, "Will you bring the guys out so we could interview them?" And they wouldn't do that. They said, no, we're just going to stay in the locker room, and the male reporter's going to interview them, and screw you. So that's what the lawsuit was about. It was not because women wanted to go peeking in the locker room. It's because the owners and the managers would not let them have equal access anywhere. And that has become such a cause célèbre. I think so many people out there think it's that women are dying to get into that locker room. And I think Lisa Olson and others would, and those of us who've actually done this sort of thing, I didn't do it very often, but when you do it, you're terribly embarrassed. You don't want to be in that place, but it's the only place you can do your job. And I think you've pointed it out very well that that hasn't changed. I mean, as long as there's a perception that women are in there to do something other than their jobs, then they're going to get into trouble with that, I think. Another statistic, and maybe Carol knows this better, I think the thing you're talking about being outnumbered in journalism school, wasn't there a celebrated story some years ago that 70% of journalism students were women, and therefore it was going to become a pink-collar ghetto profession, and therefore it was going to become a downgraded profession? I remember this came out of where? The University of Maryland.
University of Maryland study where the question was, and there's some statistics showing that as women go into more of a profession, it is then has less prestige, and then owners feel they can pay less.
Right. I think we have time for maybe 3 more questions. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Erica Piedad, and I'm really impressed because what I hear you talking about is oppression and inequality, and I really hear you fighting for that. I work with alcohol and drug abuse among pregnant and parenting women, and I'm in the community working predominantly with women who are disenfranchised. And I want to know, how can we tap into people who have a lot of power, because the media does have a lot of power? How can we tap into you in terms of the work that we're doing to try to get rid of inequality and also oppression, and also trying to get rights for women out there in terms of health care, in terms of just being treated and valued and respected. So I want to know, how can we tap into your power in terms of your influence to write about issues like these and just share the ideas that we have?
Gail, do you have any advice on how to get into television or get those stories on television?
I think you pick, first of all, you watch particular programs and pick someone who you think, after watching their work, will be someone who will be empathetic, who will be inclined to listen. I don't know about everyone else. I read my mail. And a well-written letter very often will get a response and a phone call and a follow-up, because those are important stories in my view. And I think that all too often people tend to think of the media as this brick wall that is unfeeling and uncaring and uninterested in what they have to say. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I know it can be frustrating trying to batter through that wall sometimes, but I do think that the secret is to pick one person who you think will listen, and I think that probably they will.
It's an uphill battle because, if you'll notice, even the presidential campaigns this year, it's all about the middle class. The poor, except when you get to a city where there's certain people vote, we're not talking about the poor, we're not talking about the underclass. Journalism today is becoming a middle-class profession. You don't have really working-class people, blue-collar people who used to dominate the journalism profession, who came from those places. And I think in most newsrooms, and I think Dave may see this as true, the interest in those kind of stories, the interest in stories about the disadvantaged, is not high.
It's not as fashionable as it used to be. If you just look at the paper, I'll take the Globe, not television or others, you have to scheme and plot and be ingenious about how you get their attention. Eventually you have to persuade an editor or a reporter that, damn it, this is worth something, and you have to inveigle them. You have to look on it like you were writing a grant proposal. Present it like they're going to give you money. They're going to give you attention in the paper. You're competing against any number of other interests. There's limited news hole. I think the Globe probably often is criticized as doing too much of this kind of, sobby, good government kind of, oh God, another story about battered women or welfare mothers. Give us a break. You have to seduce the news coverage. Look for the bylines. Look for the editors. Find out who they are. Call them up. Invite them to well-planned, well-orchestrated events. Never lie. Don't be found out doing anything deceitful. Not that you would, but many people do. And try and prevail ultimately and say, this is news. Our people buy your paper. I can put 55 women in a church basement in East Cambridge. You should come over. Send somebody over here. Maybe we take a photograph. Maybe we send a story. Maybe we include a paragraph in a roundup. But eventually, you got to wear us down. It's like anything else.
Thank
you. It's hard.
Thank you.
Thank
We're
you very
almost worn down here. We've got Jeff and then one question over here, and we're done.
I'm Jeff Trimble. I appreciate what you've said, but feel compelled to cite counterexample to what you're saying of my own career. In 1977, when I was finishing college as an undergraduate with a journalism major, my interview with a Washington Post recruiter lasted 4 minutes. He's now very senior at the Washington Post. When he saw me, he said, "Well, your resume looks pretty good, but I can't hire you. You're not a woman. You're not black." I went to work for the Kansas City Star. I worked hard. I made a good career in journalism. The publication at which I work, I just don't see sex bias in it at all. It's co-edited by a man and a woman.
This is
One
US
of my
News.
this is U.S. News and World Report. One of my boss's mother's sitting right here, Dean Lord, and if I cross Barry Lord, I'm not dealing with a woman. I'm dealing with my boss. This has been my entire career of now 14 years of journalism, 8 of which have been spent abroad, where I worked toe-to-toe with female journalists who never were treated as... We just worked. We worked in the Middle East. We worked in Moscow together. We worked everywhere, and we worked on equal terms. We weren't looking for a break based on sex, based on anything. We just went out and worked. The final thing I'd say is, Gail, I think your comment about female anchors on commercial television is terrifically unfair. Just as an amateur watching television here in Boston, I think that the women... I'm thinking of one in particular, are really professional in the business about the smile, and what they do, I think, is really terrifically unfair. So I don't really have a question. I'm just citing by counter comment that you can cite all the studies you want, but my career, I simply have not seen the things you're talking about, and in a way, that is a tribute to Nan Robertson and the kinds of things that were done by people that generation. Thank you.
If I can respond to that, I'm very glad you made that point, because I was sitting here feeling very badly. You're right, but Boston is the exception. Go out in the hinterlands. You're absolutely correct. Boston does have some terrific women on the air, and I should have mentioned that, and I'm sorry I didn't. But go out.
And
what
some
you will
women in
find-
management here, too. Emily Rooney's here. She runs Channel 5's news operation. Okay, Carol?
I would say that I think what we're seeing is that at the entry level and as you're moving up, I think you're absolutely right that there is a lot of equality between men and women. Where you still have the issues that are really surfacing is mid-career glass ceiling kind of things, where I think as you sort of look around, and maybe this is changing, but as you look around, you're going to see that some women are going to run into a glass ceiling that men don't. It's still there, but I do think you're right that it is certainly much less than it was.
Good. We have time for just one quick last question.
Hi, my name is Delia Cabe Gill, and my question is for Nan Robertson. I was wondering if you worry about complacency among young women journalists today, that they may get this false impression that there's many of them because, like, well, I was a BU student too, and I was one of the 5 women out of whatever. But I was just wondering if you ever worry if women might get complacent, that this was something your generation had to deal with, and our generation has got it, quote, easy.
You know, I think young women are getting a lot better about this kind of thing, about recognizing who came before them. One of the plaintiffs said to me as I was beginning research for this book, that because the Times case sort of unrolled the last dramatic weeks during a print blackout in New York, it was never adequately covered, and because it was settled out of court, along with all of the other media suits involving sex discrimination, she said, "Our stories are written in sand." And I thought to myself, no, they aren't, because there will be this book. And young women of the Times are going up to Betsy Wade and Grace Gluck and saying, we had no idea that this happened. I noticed a tremendously growing sensitivity among younger women who are learning where they came from and the debts that they owe to some who went before them. And I hope they remember us. Also, I was enormously sort of thrilled. I marched in Washington on Sunday, and I was thrilled to see the huge numbers of young women marching, being activists. There was a period during the 80s when I really had a series of sinking spells, that all of this would somehow go unnoticed, that nobody would remember us and know where they came from. It's terribly important for everybody to know their history and their roots. And so I'm really feeling very hopeful about young women. I think they're beginning to realize that something happened before them that made it possible for them to have jobs and do things that were not possible for women of my generation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd like to close by thanking all of you. Each one of you has contributed something unique tonight. And I feel, since we've talked an awful lot about the heroic women who really were unheralded, I think we also have to remember that there were the men who gave them their first breaks, and that they are also still unheralded. So let's hear it for all of them. Thank you.